Hey there, Miss Monist here with Chapter 7 of the Phantom Tollbooth. Chapter 7 is called The Royal Banquet. So remember, Milo and Talk have escaped the dungeon. All they had to do was hit a silly button on the wall and then they were free. They ran across the cabinet or the clergymen of the king of Dictionopolis, and they are being hurried along to the palace for a banquet. "Right this way, follow us, come along, step lively, here we go," they shouted, hopping from the wagon and bounding up the broad marble stairway. Milo and Talk followed close behind. It was a strange-looking palace, and if he didn't know better, Milo would have said that it looked exactly like an enormous book, standing on an end with its front door in the lower part of the binding, just where they usually place the publisher's name. So I think he means like this. So like you open the door. Once inside, they hurried down a long hallway which glittered with crystal chandeliers and echoed with their footsteps.
It's really not got to deal with someone up behind you.
The walls and ceiling were covered with mirrors whose reflections danced dizzily along with them, and the footmen bowed coldly. "We must be terribly late," gasped the Earl nervously as they reached the tall doors of the banquet hall. It was a vast room full of people loudly talking and arguing. The long table was carefully set with gold plates and linen napkins. An attendant stood behind each chair, and at the center, raised slightly above the others, was a throne covered in crimson cloth. It's like a dark red, I think. Directly behind on the wall was the royal coat of arms, flanked by the flags of Dictionopolis. There it is. You notice the letters in the middle? A-E-I-O-N-U. What do those letters mean? Why are they special enough to be in the coat of arms? Milo noticed many of the people he had seen from the marketplace. The letterman was busy explaining to an interested group the history of W, and off in a corner the humbug and the spelling bee were arguing fiercely about nothing at all. Officer Shrift wandered through the crowd suspiciously, muttering, "Guilty, guilty, they're all guilty," and on noticing Milo, brightened visibly and commented in passing, "Is it 6 million years already? My, how time flies." Everyone seemed quite grumpy about having to wait for lunch, and they were all relieved to see the tardy guests arrive. "Certainly glad you finally made it, old man," said the humbug, cordially pumping Milo's hand. "As guest of honor, you must choose the menu, of course." "Oh my," he thought, not knowing what to say. "Be quick about it," suggested the spelling bee. "I'm famished, F-A-M-I-S-H-E-D. As Milo tried to think, there was an ear-shattering blast of trumpets, entirely off-key, and a page announced to the startled guest, "King Azaz, the Unabridged." The king strode through the door and over to the table and settled his great bulk onto the throne, calling irritably, "Places, everyone, places." He was the largest man Milo had ever seen, and with a great stomach, large piercing eyes, a gray beard that reached to his waist, and a silver signet ring on the little finger of his left hand. He also wore a small crown and a robe with letters of the alphabet beautifully embroidered all over it. "What have we here?" he said, staring down at Talk and Milo as everyone took their place. There's the king of Dictionopolis. "If you please," said Milo, "my name is Milo, and this is Talk. Thank you very much for inviting us to your banquet. I think your palace is beautiful." "Exquisite," corrected the Duke. "Lovely," counseled the minister. "Handsome," recommended the Count. "Pretty," hinted the Earl. "Charming," submitted the Undersecretary. "Silence," suggested the King. "Now, young man, what can you do to entertain us? Sing songs, tell stories, compose sonnets, juggle plates, do tumbling tricks? What is it?" "I can't do any of those things," admitted Milo. "What an ordinary little boy," commented the King. "Why, my cabinet members can do all sorts of things. The Duke here can make mountains out of molehills. The minister splits hairs. The Count makes hay while the sun shines. The Earl leaves no stone unturned. And the Undersecretary," he finished ominously, "hangs by a thread. Can't you do anything at all?" "I can count to 1,000, said Milo. Arg, numbers. Never mention numbers here. Only use them when we absolutely have to, growled Azaz disgustedly. Now why don't you and Talk come here and sit next to me and we'll have some dinner. Are you ready with the menu? Reminded Humbug. Well, said Milo, remembering that his mother always told him to eat lightly when he was a guest. Why don't we have a light meal? A light meal it shall be, roared the bug, waving his arms. The waiters rushed in carrying large serving platters and set them on the table in front of the king. When he lifted the covers, shafts of brilliant colored light leapt from the plates and bounced around the ceiling, the walls, across the floor, and out the windows. Not a very substantial meal, said the humbug, rubbing his eyes, but quite an attractive one. Perhaps you can suggest something a little more filling. The king clapped his hands. The platters were removed, and without thinking, Milo quickly suggested, well, in that case, I think we ought to have a square meal of... A square meal it is, shouted the humbug again. The king clapped his hands once more, and the waiters reappeared, carrying plates heaped high with steaming squares of all sizes and colors. Ugh, said the spelling bee, tasting one. These are awful. There's a plate of heaping squares. No one else seemed to like them very much either, and the humbug got one caught in his throat and almost choked. Time for the speeches, announced the king as the plates were once again removed and everyone looked glum. You first, he commanded, pointing to Milo. Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen, started Milo timidly, I would like to take this opportunity to say that in all the... That's quite enough, snapped the king. Mustn't take all day. But I'd just begun, objected Milo. Next, bellowed the king. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, vanilla ice cream, recited the humbug, bouncing up and down quickly. What a strange speech, thought Milo, for he'd heard many in the past and knew that they were supposed to be long and dull. Dull is like boring. Hamburgers, corn on the cob, chocolate pudding, pudding, said the spelling bee in his turn. Frankfurter, sour pickles, strawberry jam, shouted Officer Shrift from his chair. Since he was taller sitting than standing, he didn't bother to get up. And so down the line it went, with each guest rising briefly, making a short speech, and then resuming his place. When everyone had finished, the king rose. Pâté de foie gras soupe à l'aignon, façon sous cloche, salade, endive, fromages, et fruits, et demi-tasse, he said carefully, and clapped his hands again. The waiters reappeared immediately, carrying heavy hot trays, which they set on the table. Each one contained the exact words spoken by the various guests, and they all began eating immediately. What kind of speech would you give if you knew you were going to eat your words? Dig in, said the king, poking Milo with his elbow and looking disapprovingly at his plate. I can say that I don't think much of your choice. I didn't know that I was going to have to eat my words, objected Milo. Of course, everyone here does, the king grunted. You should have made a tastier speech. Milo looked around at everyone busily stuffing himself and then back down at his own appetizing plate. It certainly didn't look worth eating, and he was so very hungry. Here, try some somersaults, suggested the Duke. It improves the flavor. Have a rigmarole, offered the Count, passing a bread basket. Or a ragamuffin, seconded the minister. Perhaps you'd care for a cinnamon bun, suggested the Duke. Why not just wait for your desserts, mumbled the Earl indistinctively, his mouth full of food. How many times must I tell you not to bite off more than you can chew, snapped the undersecretary, patting the distressed Earl on the back. In one ear and out the other, scolded the Duke, attempting to stuff one of his words through the Earl's head. If it isn't one thing, it's another, chided the minister. Out of the frying pan into the fire, shouted the Count, burning himself badly. Well, you don't have to bite my head off, screamed the terrified Earl, and flew at the others in a rage. The five of them scuffled wildly under the table. Stop that at once, thundered Azaz, or I'll ban it. Miss Monis back with the next chapter of The Phantom Tollbooth, and chapter 7 is called The Royal Banquet. So remember, Milo and Talk had escaped the dungeon. There was just a button. As soon as they hit the button, they were able to leave the dungeon. And they find the